Thank you for joining me for a conversation about our collaboration with a wonderful organization, Planet Forward. Climate change is having a huge impact on our water resources. Whether it's droughts or floods, people are experiencing climate change through water change. At the Walton Family Foundation, we believe that communities can adapt to the impacts of climate change and become more resilient. But in order to do that, they need access to high quality fact-based information. And we see environmental journalism that lifts up communities on the front lines of climate change, whether they're fishermen or farmers or ranchers or others who are experiencing that water change as critical in this moment. These voices help us to understand the challenges that we face so that we can look for solutions together. So I am delighted today to be joined by Frank Sesno to discuss these issues. Frank is the director of Planet Forward at George Washington University, where he's building a unique movement of young journalists from universities across the country equipped to tackle these challenges. Planet Forward is really one of the leading environmental initiatives of its kind that's focused on teaching effective environmental storytelling skills. Frank, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. So let's jump right in. Can you tell me a little bit about the big picture of environmental journalism today and how you see Planet Forward's role in helping grow the field?
Sure. The big picture of environmental journalism today is I think it's more important than it's ever been because of the multiple crises and challenges that we confront, whether that's climate change or population movement. We see people moving because of climate and water and other things, plastics and the incredible challenge that we confront there, converting to renewable energy, electrification through EVs and all the rest. I mean, there is so much going on, and it is so profoundly connected to the lives that we lead, the lives that everybody leads. So what the environmental journalism does is it connects these developments and these stories to people so they can understand how what's taking place out there affects them, their neighbors, their communities, the choices and the decisions that we all confront, and the information that we're getting, because we're getting updated and newer information that informs us on all these. Stories make it real, and people remember stories. People also connect with other people through stories. So if someone is living amidst wildfires or coastal erosion or intense record-breaking heat, when you read about that as a number, it's a number. When you read or hear or watch that as a story about a human being, it becomes real. So that's why I think environmental journalism is so critical right now, especially when we think about all the noise and mis and disinformation that's out there. What we're doing with Planet Forward is we're trying to inspire that next generation. And yes, the storytellers, but also people who are going to lead in a variety of walks of life, whether it's through journalism or filmmaking or through public service, business, anything else. They need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to tell stories, to connect, to inform, to mobilize, and then to lead toward informed action.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. We need to improve how we tell our story in our movement in general. One of the things that the Walton Family Foundation is really focusing on is doing our part to help make sure that communities that are experiencing climate change have a more central role in making the decisions about water issues moving forward, especially those communities that haven't been part of the process in the past, that have been left out. We work from the idea that those that are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution and can help us find those solutions. So in our work in the Colorado River, for example, we've been really focusing on doing our part to help ensure that tribal voices are at the table in these decision-making conversations. I know that Planet Forward's also been working to help bring more tribal reporters into the field. Can you talk a little bit about that work? Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, be a pleasure. One of the central premises of Planet Forward, which is a publishing platform, a multimedia publishing platform for students, to tell the stories about food, water, energy, the built environment, biodiversity, environmental justice, is that this must be, because it is by definition, a broad, inclusive conversation. And as we know, too many times, it is communities of color, indigenous communities, tribal communities that have been downstream
Mhm.
from the pollution, the environmental degradation, and who are on the front lines of climate change. So built into what we've done with Planet Forward is a consortium of colleges and universities and Planet Forward correspondent students from across the country, from very diverse communities, because this needs to be everyone's story, right?
Mhm.
I'm so proud that 2 years ago, two Indigenous students, graduate students, approached us and said, wow, we'd like to create something and work with Planet Forward. And we said, go for it. So they did, and we've set up, and we're now in year 2 of the Indigenous Student Correspondent Program. The Indigenous Student Correspondent Program links young Indigenous students in this program run by Indigenous, well, they were graduate students. One of them is now out in the real world, but still working with us. They have a series of workshops where they hear from other Indigenous experts, storytellers, journalists. They develop stories of, by, and for their communities, and they tell these stories. And they share it amongst themselves and then with a broader audience. We also work with, through the universities, a group of HBCUs and others. So there's this very deliberate effort to engage voices and empower them to tell these stories from and about their communities. And it's incredible what they do and the stories they tell. And they are not stories, very deliberately, just about victimhood and poverty. What so many of these young people want to do is they want to tell the stories of resilience and ingenuity and invention and innovation from their communities, and they've done that. And it's just a brilliant, beautiful thing to see, and they're great stories too.
Mhm. That's wonderful. I love that inspiration of the next generation.
Yeah, can I turn the table for just a minute? Because I think this is such an interesting conversation, and I'm so grateful to what Walton Family Foundation does because this is so important. But I know you care so deeply about environmental journalism. Maybe why did why has Walton Family Foundation done this? Why invest in this space?
Yeah. So at the Walton Family Foundation, we believe that an informed public makes better decisions and makes better environmental decisions. And that's why we're committed to funding independent, enterprising environmental journalism. Um, Very resonant with your story about the Indigenous Network, we want to break down the barriers that have excluded voices and ideas from consideration in the past. And we think that it becomes even more important in a situation that we're going through now, like climate change, where things are rapidly changing. So I love, in thinking about environmental journalism, I love the quote from the poet Amanda Gorman at the last presidential inauguration, where she said, every day we write the future. Together we sign it. Together we declare it. Together we share it. And I think for those of us in the conservation movement, her words ring especially true right now. We see environmental reporters as those storytellers who are called to write the future by covering it and by telling the story of what's happening on our planet every single day. By documenting that, by sharing it, journalists have a really special role in increasing our collective awareness, and beyond that, increasing our collective commitment to act.
Yeah.
Right now, millions of people are experiencing climate change through its impact on water. We read all the time about water shortages from the prolonged and severe droughts in the West, about flooding in the center of the country, and about the disappearing coastlines that are caused by rising sea levels. Every news cycle is filled with these stories. And environmental coverage, beyond its intrinsic value, it's also intimately connected to urgent public health questions and to issues of economic and social justice. And while all this is happening and these issues are ever more present and important, newsrooms covering these issues are increasingly spread thin. According to the Pew Research Center, newsrooms have shrunk by 25% in the last 15 years, and the environmental beat is often the first to go. So we at Walton and philanthropy, we believe that we can help bridge the gap between the demand for robust environmental reporting and the shortage of journalists, the shortage of storytellers. We know that there's strong public support for more accurate, fact-based, informative reporting on the environment. Recently, we helped sponsor a poll with Morning Consult that showed that 3 in 5 voters say that it's important for local news, even local news, to cover issues of climate change. So we see growing the future of environmental journalism as a critical part of meeting that need and lifting up the problem, but also, like you're saying, lifting up the solution and the inspiration, the hope for our future.
Could I just say, Maura, I think
Please.
what you just said is so important. And I really want to express on behalf of everybody in journalism and maybe in the world, my appreciation for what Walton Family Foundation is doing. I started my career in local news at a very small radio station where we had full-time news people in a town of 16,000. Okay, that doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did is we made every issue real and local.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was a problem at the if the river was over, was running over its banks and flooding, if the bridge was collapsing, that's what you do in local journalism. You connect people to their community.
Mm-hmm.
And in environmental journalism, when we think about this, when we think about climate change, sure, you can have a million stories about the global effects, but when you talk about what's happening in your town, in your community, in your city, that's when people connect. And that's when people say, oh, I get it. And we've seen that with extreme heat when it's told from the community. It's also where trusted sources come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're hearing a neighbor or you're hearing your local elected official. And so that connection that you're helping to make environment to community is so important, and it's filling a real need, because you say that's where the collapse in journalism has been most notable.
Yeah. Well, we hope so. We're just one foundation, but we hope that by playing a small part, we can inspire others and inspire more. So as you said, Frank, you were a local reporter. You've really done it all in journalism, right? You were a White House reporter. You won an Emmy. You're a very experienced journalist. So from your perspective, why is it important that philanthropy is increasing its importance for journalism, and how can the audience be confident that the stories they're reading aren't being too heavily influenced by the funders, by the foundations that are coming to the table?
Great question. I'm really glad. Well, first of all, I think we just talked about the importance of environmental journalism and the impact on the local community. All stories are local. That's where people start. And that's where understanding gets built from your own lived experience, right? You're going out in your backyard and you're smelling wildfire smoke, or you worry about your house burning down, or the coast going away, or the corn not growing, or whatever it is. That's where it gets real, and that's where people start saying, okay, what do we do about this? Because it's about their lives, their kids, their neighbors, their community. I think we have a real problem. We know this in trust in journalism and media today.
Mm-hmm.
The public is very polarized. Broadly speaking, institutions do not win the trust of the public, and media are right up there or down there in that lack of trust. So we need transparency across the board. And transparency means that those who are telling the stories explain to their audience where those stories are coming from, who those sources are they're talking to, whether there's an agenda in a survey or a poll or whatever that they're sharing. Transparency also comes from where the funding comes from, whether it's a traditional sponsor or advertiser, and you understand that they don't have a role, or you should, in the editorial product, or whether the funding is philanthropic. We at Planet Forward have been able to live a very transparent life, and it's worked well because we have funding from organizations like Walton Family Foundation and others. And we just say clearly to people, this support helps us do our job, helps us put these stories out, but there is no influence from these organizations. These organizations are funding the enterprise of storytelling, the enterprise of getting fact-based, verifiable information creatively expressed so that people can remember it, right? Or at least be aware of it to the public. So I think there's a very important role and a very, frankly, easy role for philanthropy in this space to say, we are funding the enterprise, not the product. We do not want to influence the product beyond saying, okay, go cover water. And that, I think, is the clearest way to connect with and build trust with the public.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And we really believe in that. We call it a firewall, right? Creating that distance. And we hope the more that we lift up, that that's how we do our work, and that you guys, that's how you do your work, the more that we can create comfort, both for journalistic enterprises and for philanthropy in this space, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. We talk about a firewall from on the editorial side. We say we will be bringing our editorial judgment based on key journalistic premises and principles.
Mm-hmm.
Pursue the truth, attributable information with clear sourcing, updating stories as they develop so you can incorporate changes. If you make a
Mm-hmm.
mistake, you stand up and you raise your hand and say, oops, sorry, we did it, and we're accountable for that. That transparency is critically important. But we talk about that firewall, and we talk about it deliberately, as you say, to explain and to build trust. And I do think it works. I think people appreciate that. They know that it takes resources to do this work.
Mm-hmm.
It's time-consuming work, and sometimes it's expensive, people and transportation and going out into the field to see things. And if we're honest with people, I think they repay that with an understanding and, as I say, we hope, trust.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I loved hearing about the graduate students who started their own network. And I know that you have a plethora of amazing stories. So this might be kind of a hard question, but I'd love for you to share with us just a few of your favorite Planet Forward stories. The ones that really illustrate this connection to people, communities, environment, and the connection that we all share among those three. So give us a few examples of your favorite ones.
Okay, well, my first and favorite story is just the story of watching these young people go out into the community, make connections and contact, do real research, and then try to put together a compelling narrative that is interesting and informative. And then watching the lights go on with people is like, A, it's fun, and B, it's really empowering because you give voice to people who otherwise might not have had that voice. But as far as particular stories, we did a water series. We've had a whole series of stories on water. Too much, too little, erosion, quality of water. We're doing a series that I'm really proud of, Across the Wards, which is going across all the wards of the nation's capital to visit all demographics, all the neighborhoods. And so we had one student do one out of one of the lower income wards, DC nonprofits' efforts to reshape a community's view of the Anacostia River. The Anacostia River, dirty river that local community advocates have gathered around to clean up. Another story I love is a story that came a few years ago from a remarkable young woman, student at Cronkite School at Arizona State University. And she did a story called Water is Life, Groundwork to Solving Water Inequity on the Navajo Nation. And she looked at the remarkable percentage of people who live on the Navajo Nation who do not have running water, and what a community organization has been doing to bring tanks and water to families. And so this is it's a really interesting story. She did it as a video, very visual, beautiful, because you've got this great backdrop there. So that's a really beautiful thing. And then we travel around the world with students. We take them on storytelling expeditions. So last year we went to Iceland, and while we were in Iceland, we had students there. One student did a remarkable story on fisheries around Iceland and how climate change, population, commercial pressures have changed those fisheries. And it was a really well done story on how a very global issue comes to a particular place and how people respond to that. Just a lovely narrative that brought people there. So those are just a few of them. More I could go on and on because it's just so much. It's so interesting and so much fun to see how these young people can see problems, but also see opportunities and see the ideas and the people who are leading the way that can actually inspire hope, which is so important when things are at a crisis level in so many places. So those are some of them.
Well, it's a great point to end on, very inspirational. And I love how the stories you selected lift up all these different ways in which water is important, right? water for wildlife and rivers and communities experiencing those rivers, water and fish populations feeding communities, and water as a critical thing in people's homes. And the way the Navajo Nation was working to address universal access to water. Such important vignettes about how water and people are connected so deeply every day.
Yeah,
So,
and just a final point on that, more, if I may. I think the water story, the story, but there are, infinite stories within that, is so critically important, and it marks our time. This country was founded and established on this notion of abundance. And water, nobody thought about water, all right? There was plenty in the ground, there was plenty in the sky, we grew all our food, and we're very blessed with that. But we're now at a place where, and we see this with aquifers and river basins and everywhere else, where we now have to think very deliberately about water. Yeah. So it's the water canary in the coal mine about how we have to change our brains, and we can do it. Yeah. To live inspired and sustainable lives. And so this is one of the big generational challenges and an important story to tell.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to just that, to continuing to work together to tell these stories and to help us make this transition to more sustainably using and stewarding our water resources.
Well, thank you, Moira. I really appreciate everything that you and Walton Family Foundation are doing to support this enterprise. It's just important and, as you say, inspiring.
Okay. And we appreciate you too, Frank. Good work over there at GW.
Thanks.
Take care.
You too.